Mhm, mhm. Sure. Okay, I mean, I do think that we can start the conversation. This is a platform that we are trying out, just to also just get a sense of how we engage in this space. Thank you so much for joining us, to everyone that is on this call, that's on the webinar, and thanks to you, Zanele, who's basically our special guest that has agreed to come and share with us some of your insights into basically the state of gender-based violence and how and the efforts to address that and how that has been happening, at least in the last couple of years. So, I mean, how this webinar itself is going to flow is not necessarily intense. We have one person to speak to us, which is Zanele, but we also have Ngokeli, who is the sector coordinator for what was known as the interconnectedness and inclusivity sector, but is now known as the gender equality sector within Activate. And Charles is basically going to give us an overview and a briefing of what this discussion is about and why we're here. So what is the purpose of this? Why did your sector decide that this is a necessary conversation to have, and what you're hoping to get from this discussion? And then after that, just move straight into the three key points that we had mentioned earlier that are going to drive our discussion. First one being some of the key and burning issues around GBV that are either topical or things that are actually happening. The second part of it will be, well, the second and third part will both be directed towards, will be about the efforts that are directed towards addressing gender-based violence, and the one part will be around government initiatives. So that's where policy's perspective is going to fit in the most. And the second one will be around civil society, and that will be efforts around advocacy and lobbying governments to address GBV. So Zanele is going to be taking us through that, but Kels, please feel free to also just help us in that regard and just help us drive this conversation. And then if anyone has any questions, there is a specific tab of questions that you can post, and then I will select a few, and if there's any, then Zanele will answer them. If there's few enough, you'll be able to answer all of them, but if there somehow happens to be more, we don't really have a whole lot of people in the room, so I think we should be able to engage with everyone. But if should there be more questions that we can, then we'll select a few, and then Zanele, we can discuss those. So this is just really a discussion, a platform for us to just share some insights and thoughts. Kels, you'll tell us what you hope the outcome will be, but I do think that we just generally have to get a sense of whether or not this is a space that we think we can really carry forward as well in terms of hosting and having these discussions. So Kels, I think I'll just hand over to you now to just give us a briefing around why we're here and what you hope us.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. So just a quick one, just to quickly introduce myself. So the name is Ngokeli Mangai. I work for Activate as the Gender Equality Sector Coordinator. So the reason for us having this conversation specifically is around us looking at the progress that has been made already, because we also need to note that there was that 5-point plan, the emergency plan that the president last year announced to the nation in front of the joint sitting in Parliament. But I also need us to try and take stock, because we've been speaking too much, but then the action is kind of lacking. Of course, we need to commend them on certain aspects around policy reform itself. We need to try and also commend them on the work that they are pushing for. However, we also need to have more of a action-orientated space where we start doing the work instead of speaking the talk, but do the work, right? So, for example, because I'm checking now for some stats, and I was sitting with Nomtika yesterday, and I'm saying to her, you know, because she already knows this, because these are conversations we have all the time, and what came out was a woman is murdered every 3 hours, right, in South Africa, and many are assaulted and raped before death, right? But now, you get where I'm going with this, and there's already, if I'm to mention a few, the Uyinene trial being one, the Uyinene murder, actually. Let's use that as a starting point, and how that has impacted the community itself, but also how this can also assist us in the pushing into the right direction. Does that make sense with everyone? I hope it does. Eh?
Mm-hmm.
So mainly the conversation we're having today is around taking stock and seeing progress. Where is the progress? Because we have not necessarily been checking in on each other based on the progress that has been made by us as civil society, but also as government working together in addressing the scourge itself, but also looking at the structural determinants thereof. Because we need to be very aware that when we speak on gender-based violence, we don't speak on gender-based violence from one perspective. We speak from gender-based violence in different perspectives because there's different people with different realities. So I think that's mainly what I actually had in mind, the conversation to be around, and what should then come out is what is the way forward for us as civil society working together in assistance with government in these specific policy strides, as well as psychosocial support for our survivors, survivors, but as well as also civil society, because this is heavy work, okay?
Yeah.
I think for now, I'm going to start there, Nomtika.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And so it is already 11 as well. So just before we also just jump in, Kels, this is a session that is being recorded, and other people might not necessarily know what the gender equality and interconnectedness sector is about. So if you're going to just give us a bit of an overview of Activate and how this is a relevant conversation within Activate.
Okay. So the gender equality sector itself, when we speak about it, we're looking not specifically, because people assume that when we speak on gender equality, we're only speaking on gender-based violence. That is just one part of gender equality. There's many other things we need to look at in terms of the economic empowerment of women, for example. We're looking at issues around justice, access to justice for LGBTI, but also for the marginalized groups that already exist within South Africa. And when we then came as the Activate Network, we then sat and we said, but then we have this variety of people already in our network. And these people are coming from different provinces with different contexts. Right. So what we then felt was, okay, let's give the space where we let our young people in these different provinces who are our gender equality champions of Activate, that is. So we give them the opportunity to engage with civil society in their own provinces around that specific issue. Let's take, for example, a simple example. The Mpumalanga gender equality champions have identified a critical issue around the increase in human trafficking within the province itself. And what they are then trying to do is work with government, local government, but also with civil society and other stakeholders such as Activate, in specifically coming up with innovative ideas as to how then can we address this specific issue in that specific province.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much, Kels. So Zanele, I'm just gonna get right into it. I like sort of the framing of this conversation because I know that you have been engaging on this in the last couple of weeks, because we've had some consultations from one of the big organizations that will possibly be doing a project in South Africa. And one of the things that we have been discussing over the last couple of weeks is what the key issues have been in relation to gender-based violence in South Africa and what those efforts have been. So I know that this is not necessarily an unfamiliar conversation for you, just beyond the fact that this is already the work that you do. So I'm just handing over to you now in terms of just talking to us around what some of the key issues have been, and the key discussions and how some of those had come about.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nomtika, and our colleague, for that very detailed overview on these issues. So I'm just going to share 7 primary burning issues that have emerged in the last couple of months, and that we could possibly engage on as we discuss gender-based violence and gender equality and reflect on the so on and so forth. So the first is the decriminalization of sex work. So the decriminalization of sex work is basically a very urgent requirement and a much needed intervention to be prioritized when it comes to addressing violence against women, gender-based violence, and femicide. I think on the International Sex Worker Rights Day earlier, SWET released a report that reveals the high levels, particularly of brutal forms of violence leveled against sex workers in South Africa, when nearly half of the 101 sex workers who died in 2018 and 19 were reported to have been murdered. So protecting and upholding sex worker human rights, including their constitutional rights to access to healthcare, freedom from violence, access to justice and labor law protection is very much needed and necessary to realize equality and violence-free societies for all. In fact, the saddest thing is that the Women's Charter of 1994 still refers to sex work as prostitution. And we know how discriminative, prejudice, and overall damaging that kind of language is. And essentially, that goes against our constitutional values as a nation. So a domestic instrument such as the Women's Charter needs to be reviewed and urgently amended, and not be a weapon that promotes, stigmatization, the policing of women's bodies, and further silencing of women and other key vulnerable groups. The second is gender-based violence and femicide. So the road to, I guess, putting the spotlight on the scourge of violence against women and calling for the end to gender-based violence has been quite long and slow, well, in my opinion. And amongst efforts, our organization was involved in the Stop Gender Violence campaign, which was primarily aimed at calling for a national strategic plan on gender-based violence since 2013. And this was a very well coordinated civil society-led initiative. So I guess amid these efforts, violence against women and children has remained at a constant all-time high. And the South African Police Services reports, Stats SA reports, and other reporting mechanisms, including social media, have shown us that missing persons reports are being filed every day. Interpersonal violence incidences are spiking sky-high levels. Sexual violence and relative abuse, women and girls being brutally and mercilessly killed, etc. All these just continue. So basically, we saw women from all corners of life saying enough is enough in 2018. And they were as loud and angrier as ever have been. And they were literally calling Mayday to the president and country leadership and totally shutting down the country, marching to parliament and all over the country to table their grievances and delivering the 24 demands. Thereafter, we saw the president respond with the first ever presidential summit on GBV, which invited over 200 key stakeholders to raise their concerns, which then also resulted in a declaration on gender-based violence being tabled. And then fast forward to the establishment of an interim steering committee that would assist in efforts to coordinate the response to sexual, gender-based violence and femicide in the country. So I guess since then, the responses have been to some level happening swiftly. I guess only if government could deliver at this pace for all matters, this country would technically be at a different stage of growth and progress. But we also had the Women's Parliament discussions last year in August around the gender machinery framework, and there are still ongoing consultations relating to this, and subsequent approval of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence as well. And like my colleagues just said now, we then saw the launch of the 5-point strategic plan, or rather emergency plan on gender-based violence. And there are a couple of other processes that I believe are underway. Overall, in terms of gender-based violence, I would say this is great progress, but we are definitely nowhere near where we should be yet. All right, and then the third point would be the refugee and migrant crisis. So I think we have seen the migrant, refugee, and asylum seekers crisis in the recent days, especially in the metros of Gauteng and the Western Cape, in the news, in the tabloids, on social media, etc. And South Africa has quite an influx of refugees and internally displaced persons. And there are various challenges that they are going through. And there was also a law that was amended not long ago that has led to civil society sort of saying this goes against the constitutional rights of persons that live within the borders of the country. And I will go through that a bit more in detail when we get to the second element of our conversation. But overall, the refugee and migrants crisis is multi-dimensional. There are lots of factors at play in the current crisis. And most of it came from the xenophobic attacks. And that just led the country into a spiraling frenzy in the last years. But overall, I could say that we have come a long way, and we still have a long way to go as a country in terms of responding to the needs of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers, and doing some introspection as a country to assess our capacity and investment towards this regard. What we do know is that South Africa should be a safe space for every single individual who resides within its boundaries, just as the Constitution refers. Okay, so without going into much detail on that, I will touch on the fourth burning issue, which is the National Health Insurance Act and Bill. So South Africa is sort of has initiated processes in response to the global agenda and regional priorities, and it is steadily pioneering to move towards universally accessible healthcare services and support for all in South Africa. We noted that there are consultations that are largely underway at provincial and somewhat district level, and there are calls for public participation and submissions that are active as well. So what we did notice is that there are a lot of loopholes and gaps that are being identified by various stakeholders that are engaging in the NHI processes, by individual citizens and civil society, even private sector, academia, and health professionals and experts alike. Basically, the process requires the participation of all citizens in South Africa. And I think no one should exempt themselves from engaging in these processes, because we do not want to leave anyone behind. And hopefully there will be a favorable outcome in the end. And it's something to really follow up on as it affects everyone. So the fifth burning issue, I guess, would be the ever-increasing youth unemployment rate. So South Africa has the largest population of young people, and I believe this will remain at this trend for the next 20 to 30 years. But clearly not enough is being done to address the staggering rate of youth unemployment and its socioeconomic determinants and impact it has on our developing and growing nation. So we have not seen youth leadership, active participation, meaningful youth involvement, meaningful youth engagement, and youth-led accountability being championed as it should. And there was mention of youth-orientated initiatives through the State of the Nation address that was recently delivered earlier this year to combat youth unemployment, but we are not immune to these announcements. I think with also the previous presidents, there have been countless efforts to initiate initiatives to combat youth unemployment, but instead of seeing these being practically implemented and leading to a reduction in youth unemployment and the capacity building of young people, we are finding that, the numbers are going up instead of down. So next year, for example, another class of matriculants will graduate, and only a handful are able to access tertiary institutions, and a few less are able to obtain entry-level placements, and a great majority fall into the unemployment cycle, and they are often left not in employment, neither education nor training. And that is leaving the young generation susceptible to opportunistic socioeconomic challenges, and the cycle just goes on and on and on. So I was also just looking at this a little bit more, and interestingly, there is a national youth service framework. So basically, that's a guide on youth volunteerism for young people to basically try and contribute in some way, shape, or form to the development of the country. But what we need is to rather look at meaningful ways to professionalize youth work instead of calling for steadfast volunteerism. And we need to be looking at ways that we can compensate young people for their contribution and subsidize young people for them to be able to afford the basic necessities. Because simply, realistically speaking, life without any source of income or financial aid can't be practically sustained through them alone. So maybe just 2 more points under this, umbrella of youth unemployment is that government needs to see young people as partners in development and not just as beneficiaries to services and information. And also they need to be seen as experts and as experienced individuals when doing the work that they do in their voluntary capacities. Again, I would say there is stronger emphasis that needs to be paid to meaningful engagement of young people, and also just intentionally engaging youth in decision-making processes and parliamentary processes in a more inclusive and sustainable manner. We noted that we don't want to see youth involvement being pioneered only through a once-off youth parliament event during the youth month in June, and also alongside the margins of the SONA, but we want to see youth engagement being pioneered throughout the rest of the year, and young people not being considered delinquents and not of priority importance to engage as partners in the development of this country. And perhaps lastly is that we have also noticed the so-called dysfunctional South African Youth Council, which was established and mandated to communicate the needs of youth in the country and serve as a voice for young people through its elected representative at provincial and local level, but that has not been happening as needed. And there is barely any interaction with young people, and definitely no visibility of the South African Youth Council at grassroots, even national level. So I guess that's one aspect that has been raised often when addressing matters of young people, and definitely one that has to be looked into, taking into consideration the president's interest in investing in young people and seeing youth as the current and future leaders of this country. And I'll touch on the national youth policy later on. And the 6th point of the 7th is gender equality. So in terms of this country, we saw the Gender Power Index being launched not long ago, and it revealed the gender disparities and power imbalances on a general sense. I could say that South Africa has achieved significant strides in terms of following the gender equality global guidelines and indicators and targets for success, of which we also saw translated in South Africa's submission of the SDG voluntary report review. And we noticed with South Africa in terms of gender equality, we have about 50+% of seats in parliament being allocated to women. and also women being prioritized for positions within the different legislative structures at national, provincial, and district level, such as mayoral positions, councillor and ward representative positions. But if you look at the state of our nation now, when it comes to the women's agenda, it is quite evident that the appointment of women in these critical spaces does not directly translate into the realization of holistic gender equality. And I guess more work needs to be done by the female appointed legislators, judiciaries, and so forth, in terms of highlighting the seriousness of the plight of women's issues and promoting practices that will ensure that women are able to enjoy their constitutional rights without fear of retribution or harm from male peers or institutions and governance in society. And just maybe also to mention that I guess if the direct appointment of female parliamentarians was translated into progress, we would see a reduction in a lot of the issues that women are faced with now. So basically, perhaps a monitoring and evaluation process needs to take place where we review the impact of our women legislators and the changes that they are making to ensure that women in general are able to enjoy their constitutional rights in the country. And then very lastly is, you know, the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights. So South Africa, I guess, has some of the most progressive legislations and policies in the country. And particularly South Africa has one of the most enabling termination of pregnancy policies in the region in comparison with other countries in the continent. However, it is not as perfect as it is supposed to be, but it is as perfect as we need to get it to be, I guess, for women to realize their rights without restrictions when it comes to termination of pregnancies. So with sexual and reproductive health and rights, what I also wanted to highlight was the foreign instruments that we have seen impeding on our domestic legislation, which then also have infringed on women's constitutional rights to access safe termination of pregnancy, access information, access services, as well as healthcare facilities. And here I'm talking about the global gag rule. So the global gag rule has had a devastating impact on developing nations, and I could say South Africa is not foreign to that. And the extension, the Title X extension of the global gag rule has further placed women's lives at risk. And the issue of the global gag rule is not being taken into strong consideration in the country as it should be. And overall, bilateral agreements between countries should never impede on citizens' rights. Also under the umbrella is HIV and AIDS, the ever-increasing rates, you know, the prevalence of HIV AIDS amongst young people aged between 15 and 24 has been at, you know, really staggering rates since 2013. I think in 2013, the male prevalence of HIV was about 4.0%. And for females, it was 13.1%, which is 3 times higher than males. And that basically means that females are still disproportionately affected by the infectious lifestyle disease. And over 1,500 new infections are reported in South Africa each week. And I think in 2018, we were at a 6.4 million people living with HIV in the country. And so this is quite a prevalent issue. And I guess also the ever rising and alarming teenage pregnancies. I coupled with access to contraceptives and conversations around addressing the unmet need for family planning at an all-time high. And these all make it very difficult to address and fulfill the potential of young people, and the country reaping the benefits of young people's involvement, because there are barriers to young people's active participation in all aspects of engagement in country processes. And I could say then that this plays a barrier to harnessing the demographic dividend by investing in young people. I guess maybe lastly, before we shifted the conversation into the policy perspective, is that a great majority of SRHR issues are also largely linked to the age of consent that South African legislators are sleeping open-eyed on. So there are still a lot of contradictions when it comes to our legislations and policies, when it comes to the age of consent to marriage, the legal age, the age of consent to accessing abortion services, and so forth. So I guess fortunately, South Africa has the advantage of having a national adolescent and youth health policy that addresses most of these issues and seeks to address all of these legislative and policy barriers to realize SRHR needs for young people. But then also, I think we would be able to see how effective progress and impact is when it comes to the monitoring and evaluation of progress. So let me leave it there for now, and I'll table a lot more other updates as we move along.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Zanele, for those well-rounded insights. And I really deeply appreciate how you've touched on various issues, because a lot of the times there's always a very particular association of what gender-based violence is, right? And it's not a discussion that is usually intersectional and intersectoral, and just looking at things such as youth unemployment, the NHI bill, migrant and refugee rights, sex workers, queer health and rights as well, in such a huge part. I have a question here that I think before we move, I was thinking we were going to have this discussion and then at the end have questions, but I do think that this ties in very well into this piece of the conversation, especially given that we are transitioning more into a policy space now. We also know that government has obviously made commitments, right? There's GBV summits that have been held. There's 5-point plans. Even with sex work, the ANC explicitly, just before the elections, had said that they have resolved to decriminalizing sex work. And there were flowers exchanged. There was big hoo-has at the AIDS conference, and it was really a promising moment for us and people in general, as well, including sex workers. Or primarily sex workers rather, who are advocating for the decriminalization of sex work. Today, Activate actually between 1 and 2 is working with Youth Capital, and we will be coordinating a Twitter chat on the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative as well. Yet again, we've got another commitment, we've got another initiative. And although we are also impacted by foreign policies such as the global gag rule, we also have other regional and international agreements that harness and endorse our policies, or at least can allow us to work in that context regionally, such as the Maputo Plan of Action, the SADC SRHR strategy, ISA commitment. So there's generally a lot of high level of commitment that has been taking place, that is taking place in relation to just broadly addressing issues of gender-based violence and equality and equity much more broadly. And so this question is from Paul Zulu, who's joining us in this webinar as well. And the question is, besides the recent 5-point plan by the president, what is being done at community level to raise issues of GBV, as this is the playing field. I strongly feel that policy and institutional levels, much progress has been done to such an extent that GBV discussions are now at boardroom level, but the dire consequences are felt and experienced on the ground. And that is what, I mean, and that's where practical efforts and campaigns should be focused on more. So in a nutshell, they basically want to know what progress is taking place at community level in respect to GBV. And so I think that's just something that we just need to just keep in mind as we are having this discussion as well. So we are now going to then, on that note, shift our conversation into maybe if you can just tell us a little bit more. I know you've mentioned a few things, but just if you can tell us a little bit more around what some of the policy initiatives have been and how they've worked, if you're able to get to that.
Okay, thanks, Namtika. And also perhaps in response to the question that was posed by one of the webinar participants around efforts at grassroots level and any activities that are being implemented at local level, engaging communities and ordinary citizens. I wouldn't say that I am clued up to date in terms of some of the activities that have been implemented at grassroots level, reaching communities. But what I am aware of is that there's an interim steering committee that is sort of responsible for, well, they have quite a couple of meetings to engage around the next steps in the whole process of responding to gender-based violence, femicide, and sexual violence. And I am quite sure that there might have been some engagements at grassroots level, but that would need to be confirmed perhaps by one of the interim steering committee members that are more closely involved in all those processes. And I think this is a question that has also come up quite a bit in the civil society sector, because I mean, the interim steering committee is comprised of only a handful of representatives from civil society, including government, technical aspects, and so forth. And so the question is then, how does the interim steering committee filter down information and disseminate information so that it reaches each and every single person in the country that has an interest in following up on the activities of the president's response to gender-based violence? So I guess from my side, it would be that we sort of call for the publicization of the interim steering committee meeting reports. They should be displayed in a public platform that members of society can be able to access. Because if you remember, there were marches or people that marched to Parliament in 2018 and many years before that. Some marching as citizens of this country, concerned citizens of this country, and not maybe belonging to a particular civil society organization that is able to obtain feedback from the ISC. So definitely we need to call for the information from the interim steering committee to be made more public, and for any announcements in terms of activities that are coming up to be also made on public platforms so that everyone is kept up to date and there's no one fishing for information without progress. So that is my basic response to that. And then in terms of the policy outcomes thus far, which I will touch on quite briefly, I guess there has been quite a bit of some progress and movement, although, like I said, we've come a long way, but we are moving slowly at the same time, you know. And South Africa is quite traditionally notorious for that, that we are able to have all these really progressive laws and legislations on paper, in documentation, and we tend to try to follow our or abide to our regional obligations and international laws. But when it comes to the implementation, even of national action plans from government departments, we are definitely lacking. And that is why we are where we are right now. So, yes, progress in terms of the call for public participation in parliamentary processes relating to the legislative and policy aspects, I would say that progress is evident. And that is the most important thing. So at the moment, I would say there are about 3 important bills that speak to gender-based violence that are currently at departmental consultation phase. And would be tabled in Parliament after the whole consultations are being done. So the first one is the Domestic Violence Amendment Draft Bill of 2020. I think we heard in the SONA also the President mentioned this. And he also mentioned at the African Union 33rd Heads of State Summit that took place a week prior to the SONA, you know, that South Africa is quite steadfast in terms of re-evaluating the domestic violence amendment or the domestic violence bill, sorry, and also just spearheading actions towards addressing sexual violence. So at the African Union Summit, there was mention of a sexual violence conference that will take place sometime this year, and also look at the regional sexual violence amendment acts and make applicable ratifications and amendments to that. So that is good news. And also to mention that this domestic violence amendment draft bill is currently in the public domain. There has been a call for expressions or submissions to Parliament. So I really encourage the young people part of this webinar and you know, experts and individuals participating to have a look at that critically and you know, make the applicable submissions. The second one is the Criminal Matters Amendment Draft Bill, also of 2020. So this is essentially responding to, you know, increased sentences and introducing much stricter bail provisions. I think we've heard how perpetrators of crime and violence against women and children have cases opened against them, and then they are taken to court, and at the first hearing, of course, as per procedure, they are often released on bail. And so there needs to be stricter bail provisions. I think there's even groups of women and civil society organizations that are even calling for sexual offenders list to be
public.
And, there are even women that are really verbalizing the fact that if you are found guilty of, or if you are not convicted, but alleged to have committed a violent crime that resulted in the death of a woman or any other member of a vulnerable group, that no bail should be granted at all, you know. So there are a lot of very strong voices that are coming out around this, and I think the amendment of this draft bill is very important for the public to engage with. Also, it's calling for submissions. So again, encouraging webinar participants to have a look at that and make submissions so that no voice is left behind. and that government really understands the seriousness of the plight of the fight against gender-based violence and women's bodies. The third one is the criminal law. So that is the Sexual Offences and Related Matters Amendment Act, also of 2020. So that was primarily aimed at expanding the sexual offenders register, hence, the other activity I mentioned, around women calling for even the sexual offenders made public. Yeah, and we also saw very recently the sexual courts legislation being promulgated and gazetted into legislation, which is a great victory because it makes the reporting of cases a lot easier for victims and survivors of violence. So there have been concerns or grievances around a woman would be raped and they would go to a police station and the officer that would be assisting them might not be effectively capacitated on how to handle sexual violence cases or gender-based violence cases, and they wouldn't approach the whole statement taking process in a survivor or victim friendly manner, right? And there have also been concerns around the processes that are followed in terms of investigating GBV cases and sexual violence cases by the investigating officers. So the setting up of sexual offense courts to particularly focus on these sensitive issues, or rather actually not sensitive issues, but very urgent, important issues, is a very bold step for South Africa. We have always had sexual offense courts. However, they suffered a demise, a period of demise, and eventually disappeared into the years. And then recently, we recognized the importance of having these sexual offense courts to drive the conversation around ending gender-based violence. And I think that has been well received, and hence the legislation that was proclaimed by the president recently. I guess other than these would be additional bills such as the rail regulation bills, and I think there might be a taxi act that is currently under development. Apologies for not having enough information around that one. But I think the transport related regulations and amendments to acts are also very important because public transport has been largely neutral. So it's lacking that gender perspective and that gendered link when it comes to women accessing public transport and public spaces. So I'm mentioning this because during the plight of the protests around gender-based violence, we found that women were reporting that they were experiencing sexual harassment when they commute via trains, minibus, taxis, and buses because they're so crowded. They experience crime being perpetrated against them while they are in, transport surroundings or while commuting, and also just acts of sexual violence, rape, gender-based violence, physical abuse being perpetrated against them by taxi drivers or operators, the commanders, or what do you call them, conductors, and so forth. So I think these regulations around, the effective or transformative operation of transport need to include that women's voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
So also, this bill is also in the public domain, and there has been a call for submissions as well. We are making a submission to say, you know, transport shouldn't be seen just as a mode for commuting and bringing people into, you know, the different areas, but it should also ensure that gendered lens. Which other? The next is the NHI bill. So that has been going on for quite some time, and there have been quite a lot of consultations that have been taking place to feed into the NHI bill. I think we noticed a few things with the current NHI bill, and like I said, they're currently doing consultations, and they are calling for the public to make submissions so that the bill speaks to the needs of South Africans, you know, and able to provide that universally accessible healthcare and services for all, as it should. So we are also tabling a submission towards that. And, you know, some of the basic things are lacking in the current bill. For example, there needs to be a change from, you know, the language that is used. So there's a section that refers to undocumented migrants as illegal foreigners. So in the country, we cannot be accepting of such language at a legislative level, especially as we position ourselves as a democratic country and an inclusive and diverse economy. So the language in legislative documents cannot impede on this position. The last two perhaps would be the National Youth Policy, and the National Youth Policy is also in the public domain.
Sure.
And it's open for submissions. There are a lot of, I would say, new aspects that are reflected in the youth policy, but I would say there is still a missing section around how do we really meaningfully engage young people in decision-making processes at national level. How do we foster youth decision-making accountability amongst young people themselves? If you look at the structure of government right now, I don't think, or perhaps you would battle to identify a young person under 35 in those national structures. So that tells you that our current governance structure at national level is not necessarily fully accommodative of the issues of young people. So that aspect is missing in the National Youth Policy, and I think, again, encourage young people to make joint submissions to address all of these policy discrepancies and disparities, and really make their voices heard in terms of being really meaningfully engaged as partners in the development of this nation, and not just as beneficiaries of services and, you know, activities. And the very last one that I want to mention would have to be, well, it's not necessarily a policy per se, or to some extent is, but on a regional level. So you did mention, Nomtika, the SADC protocol on gender and development. So I think I also just printed something this morning that confirmed my knowledge of the processes, and I found that still till today, South Africa has not ratified the SADC protocol on gender and development, and this has been on Parliament's table for the past 3 years. You know, the SADC protocol on gender and development is a regional agreement that South Africa sort of signed in February 2008 and then ratified in 2013, the amendment. So the second amendment was then brought in around, I think, 2016, and there have been some processes, 16 or 2018, and there have been some processes at a regional level to get members to sign. So all the members in the SADC region signed the amendment, except for 3 countries, and South Africa is one of them. So I think that it is because South Africa had to follow some internal follow-ups in terms of looking at whether or not the amendment speaks to the domestic legislation and international law that South Africa is signature of, but that process has taken quite long. And if South Africa is saying that it is serious about addressing the issues of gender-based violence, violence against women on a holistic and comprehensive level, so we're not only focusing on the abuse and psychosocial elements of violence against women, but how it sort of interlinks with socio-economic and political progress in the country, then it should be prioritizing the ratification and approval of this at parliamentary level. Maybe just a little bit of salt to add to these documents and these, progressive legislative initiatives that are on South Africa's table right now, is also to acknowledge that South Africa released their Beijing Plus 25 report review for 2018 and to 2019 period. And it sort of shares the progress that the country has made since, the last report, which is Beijing Plus 20, but it's also sort of commemorating 25 years since the 1994 Beijing conference. And, the Beijing plan of action set as a benchmark to address women's issues when it comes to, gender equality and, their rights on a very broad level. So basically, South Africa is maybe done with the consultations at national level to feed into the Beijing Plus 25 processes, but us as an organization, we are in the process of developing a shadow report that will be shared with other civil society organizations, and it will be essentially a civil society joint submission to the applicable portfolio committee to recognize the loopholes and the gaps that civil society acknowledges from the report that they have given, and hopefully this will be added as an addendum to the Beijing Plus 25 Plan of Action Progress reports, because the report has already been approved by Parliament, and it questions how you can approve a report at the highest legislative house without having done, all these consultations which are now only being done now. But that's a story for another day. It basically just shows the loopholes in South Africa's system. Yeah,
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Zanele. Everyone is actually really enjoying this conversation. Unfortunately, we had, fortunately, we did have Sharon Cox from Triangle Project, and she did leave us with 2 thinking and discussion points that she had posted a bit earlier. And she says that she's looking forward to the recording of this conversation. And one of the things that she brought up, actually, which I find to be something very critical to discuss, especially around the high rates of infection. So she says she was interested in the information on the interconnectedness between high rates of infection of girls aged between 15 and 24, as well as the high rate of teenage pregnancy, which is often unplanned. And then she said that I wonder where we begin to address it as statutory rape where applicable. And I think this is a very relevant conversation, especially given that we have the Domestic Violence Act being amended, the Sexual Offences Act being amended, and that just generally it hasn't really been an active conversation when we speak about statutory rape and what the sexual debut is and how a lot of young women or young people experience their sexual debut. And I think that's a very important discussion to have when we talk about teenage pregnancy, high infection rates, as well as how those aspects relate to statutory rape, because it's the issue of statutory rape as well as the issue of comprehensive sexuality education, right? And then the second thing was now on this issue of policy that we are discussing, and I think it's in reference to the fact that earlier we did refer to sexual and reproductive health and rights and the NHI bill. So issues in relation to health when we think about gender equality and GBV. And what she was bringing up here is around the Choice on Termination of Pregnancy Act. So we've got a beautiful legal or legislation around abortion access in South Africa, where any woman of any age can request an abortion on demand until 12 weeks, and we have it legal until 24 weeks. And obviously the conditions become a little bit tighter as the gestational period progresses. But of all of that being stated, only 7% of clinics offer the service, right? And even in those 7%, even in that 7% of these clinics, you go there sometimes and you find that not everyone that is there that can offer abortion services actually does, because of things like conscientious objection. So these things, they're obviously all under this umbrella frame of reproductive violence, where we've got all of these big promises, we've got these big legislations, and I think it goes back again to that question of localizing these things. So what are these things looking like on the ground? What are these things looking like at community level? And so the question was then, what do we do to address this when so many are not able to access services, particularly more in rural areas? Because even apps like BeWise, for example, had to really be questioned and critiqued for not necessarily having very comprehensive information for adolescents and young people in regards to accessing things such as, you know, abortion services. And so I just think that that's just very good insights that Sharon has also just brought into the picture that can also help us think through what we can do more, because I know that in both accounts and in both of these points that are raised, there's a lot of work that civil society is doing, but this is also just something for us to think about, to see how can we strengthen our work when we have all of these beautiful legislation processes and the implementation is so bad. I mean, 7% is really bad. Yeah.
I think maybe I'll let my colleague to first, respond, and then I will take it. I'll respond after.
Sure. I mean, Kels, have anything to say in this regard?
I'm still listening, hey?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's fine. I just think it's also just important for us to just think about this, right? And have it as a conversation. You're welcome to say something, especially the infection rates and the teenage pregnancy, and how we need to think about statutory rape in all of that as well, Zanele. But otherwise, I just think it's also something that is important for us to know that these are other important reflection points that we need to have.
Yeah, so definitely, I think the age of consent is quite a debate across the world. I think the age of consent ranges from 11 years to as high as 20 years old around the world. But the age of consent in South Africa to sex that is, and I guess, is 16 years old. And so basically what that means is that it is the minimum age at which an individual is considered legally old enough to consent to participating in sexual activity. So I guess adolescents or individuals that are aged 15 years and younger in South Africa are not legally able to consent to sexual activity. And then such activity, if found, would result in prosecution under the term statutory rape, as you had mentioned, or whichever other equivalent local law. So when it comes to, the age of consent, I believe that there are quite a number of factors that come into play as well. And pardon me if I am incorrect, but I also aim to come back with correct information. I am not. But, there is knowledge that if a 16-year-old consents to an individual that is about 2 years older than them, then it does not constitute a statutory rape. So if a 15-year-old girl consents to sexual activity with a 17-year-old male, for example, it wouldn't be considered statutory rape. But once the age gets sort of strengthens out or stretches out, then the chances of it being considered statutory rape become a lot higher, especially after the age of 18. So definitely it is an issue that needs to be addressed because it conflicts with a lot of other age categorizations. So the legal age in South Africa is anyone at the age of 18. Then you are considered old enough to consent to making decisions on your own and not necessarily needing parental or guardianship to assist in making. But you realize that the age of accessing healthcare services like the abortion or termination of pregnancy services age is 12 years old. So in order to access healthcare service for you to perform or carry out a termination of pregnancy, you need to have parental or guardianship to authorize that. And that sort of also brings in that debate of women's autonomy when it comes to their bodies and making decisions about their bodies and reproductive health needs. So it really does contrast with quite a lot. And I think also
in a lot of ways.
The age of marriage, I think, is now 18. However, we still see practices such as ukutwala, which is constitutionally illegal, if I could so say, being practiced in rural areas of the Transkei and, also prevalent in the Eastern Cape and all those other, traditionally rural areas that have those traditional cultural norms still embedded in people living in those societies. So when you look at all of these factors, I think age of consent is a topic that still needs to be critically engaged in and really, really unpacked. And I remember I look at it one day, and I guess the overall response or outcome of my evaluation was that, first of all, we acknowledge that there are legislations and policies that are contradicting with one another, and that's placing women's sexual reproductive health and rights needs at risk. Number two, I recognize that there is a lack of intergovernmental collaboration and coordination and correspondence when it comes to, conflicting legislation and laws. So certain government departments are responsible for certain legislation that deals with age, and another government department is responsible for another, but they don't necessarily speak to one another.
Right.
Specifically, I'm talking about the Department of Home Affairs and the Department of Health. and then also maybe the Department of Justice,
Of
justice when it comes to that. Yeah, and I guess also, we've been talking about comprehensive sexuality education being integrated in the education system, and how that has sort of received negative responses from parents who are members of society that we should be actually depending on to accept such interventions and explain them better to their children, and actually pioneer the implementation of them and support, the staff implementing these. But I guess we need to, discuss these barriers and conflicts in more detail when we look at all of the policies that contradict with themselves, and also make sure that the different governmental stakeholders are able to come together in one room and acknowledge their policies and bring some type of equilibrium into the equation, so that the policies that are in place speak to the needs of women and not infringe on their constitutional rights to access to healthcare. And then in terms of reproductive rights, I think I forgot the question.
No, I think you've covered everything, actually. You've covered the most part of it, especially around the issue of the contradiction between these policies when it comes to the age of consent versus, I mean, the issue of the age of consent really can be critiqued, right, quite greatly. Is there an assumption that young kids under the age of 16 should not necessarily be having sex? And versus what consent actually looks like. So the age of consent, what does that look like? Because there's also things such as sexual grooming that are at play. And so, a consent may not necessarily be something that is as simple as a yes, but there's a question to sometimes where the yes stems from. And I think that's a very important discussion to be had. And does this then mean that adolescents are going to struggle to access contraception? Because if there's limitations with things such as age of consent, it means if a 14-year-old wants to access a contraceptive service or they want to get condoms, they will be told that they are too young to have sex. And there's just, so there's all of those. And then if a 14-year-old gets pregnant, they can access an abortion. But there's also just a whole lot of stigma that they face because they are 14 and because they want to access abortions, which will also then in turn lead to them experiencing traumatic birthing experience, because you are also being punished for having been pregnant because you are 14. So you cannot terminate this pregnancy and you carry it to term, and your labor is painful, because literally people have done research where they see that nurses or healthcare workers will sometimes be very intentional with letting people endure pain, whether during an abortion or during pregnancy, as a way of teaching them a lesson, particularly if they're young, so that that this is not something that you should be doing, type of thing. So there's a lot of contradiction just in terms of policies in relation to this age and these sexual, debut benchmarks in terms of, what the age of consent is. But there's also very, very real and very practical experiences of reproductive violence, particularly, besides the fact that, abortion is generally inaccessible. But even when I do try access it, the experience is also not always as pleasant. And so I think that's something that's very important that you've just mentioned there, Zanele. So we are actually out of time. And our webinar does have to come to an end, unfortunately, because we also have to prepare for a Twitter chat that we're having at 1 on the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. I will ask you to please if you can just wrap up now. So in terms of the engagement for civil society, if you can just wrap up in terms of what, especially for young people, what are the important commitments that you think we should be making as young people? We've got the NYP 2030 that is up for discussion. It is until the 16th of March, but I do know that youth-led and youth-centered organizations are trying to see if the date can be extended so that the process can be more inclusive, and we hope that that can be successful. But we do have the NYP 2030 that is up. We have all of these frameworks and point plans and commitments and things that we have that exist what is our role? What can we do? Acknowledging all the stuff that you've mentioned on what has been done, but what can we do as young people who are active citizens to really work towards addressing gender equality?
Thanks, Nomtika. I think civil society has been working in silos in the recent years, and young people themselves as well have not had steadfast agency to sort of address the issues that they are facing. They've also been sort of perhaps working in silos largely, but I think we have seen an increased level of collaboration, partnerships, participation, active citizenry from communities of civil society and young people, and supporting one another's efforts and advocacy. And that is a very big improvement from the past years and something that is very commendable. And so I think our role is to just continue now our collaborative partnerships and relationships and sort of speaking in a very unified voice when it comes to addressing the challenges that we are facing in the country, and also when it comes to being part of, public participation requests, and engaging in decision-making processes at a national, provincial, and district level. I think civil society is an independent sector, right? And having a civil society in this country is our constitutional democracy. And it is also to just share with the government, when we work in collaboration and partnership with them, that they are reminded that civil society and young people are not the enemy, and that government officials should seek to listen to and work with civil society and young people in the realization of social justice. So I think what we need to do is literally roll up our sleeves, because there is a very long to-do list to tackle the priorities and other equally deserving needs simultaneously. And perhaps the last point would be that we need to be calling for more intergovernmental coordination within the government structures. We need to be calling for multi-sectorial platforms to emerge, so that no vulnerable groups and critical voices are left out in the development and growth of this country. We need to be calling for seats to the table, or actually even bringing our own folding chairs to
exactly.
Whether it is ministerial advisory groups that are being set up, or departmental technical working groups. Often we realize that they are comprised of the same experts, the same stakeholders, and when you invite the same key stakeholders to each and every single engagement for a period of about a decade, you will experience an expiration of knowledge and knowledge fatigue, because it's just the same knowledge and information circulating within that space. So we need to call for inclusion and involvement as key stakeholders, as civil society and young people, that our voices be prioritized and heard and actioned out. And besides being actioned out, we want to actually be involved in the implementation of activities and the monitoring and evaluation of all the activities related to the social and economic and even the political development of this country. So those are my 2 cents around this conversation, and I look forward to any other updates that will emerge following the discussions that we have had, and hopefully we will have a follow-up webinar to reflect on progress made and changes that need to take place.
Yeah, I definitely hope for that follow-up webinar as well, Zanele. And I think there's so many things that came up from this conversation alone that I feel like we can literally take one thematic area of focus and just unpack that some more, so that we can also get a lot more from our discussions and be able to have something even more concrete, because this was really, really youthful. This was really fruitful and worth it. So, Kels, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm literally going to give you 1 minute to quickly wrap up, and then close our webinar.
I know, you know, I can take a whole day speaking. So I just wanted to give the time to Zanele to speak. So it was just mainly a call, actually, because I was having conversations with a lot of young people within the network, and you could sense the frustration that they're having in terms of not sharing knowledge or even collaborating with government and ward councils. We need to also start understanding that in order for us to start achieving gender equality and empowering young people, we need to start localizing our conversations as well. And not only that, but localizing our SDGs, to be precise, because we know SDGs all up right there within the national sphere, but never brought down to the communities. And these are the people that are bearing the grunt. And I have to concur with what has been said by you, Zanele, as well. We need to start moving, having these young people coming to these spaces and engaging with older generation, and not to say that we're taking away everything, but we are working in collaboration in order to address the specific issue. Yeah, so mainly it was mainly around that, but also looking at, that's why we have as Activate these young champions around the country, because we want these young people to start plugging into the ward space as well and engaging from that level around achieving gender equality through the partners that we're having in the different provinces, right? Because we need to understand, as I've said again, and I've been stressing, that the provinces we are in have different contexts. There's different realities in those provinces. And these young people would then be able to understand these things from the grassroots level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is how even Paul's question from earlier around how communities are being actively engaged will be answered, right? Because if we get involved from that IDP level, if we get involved with our ward, if we find ourselves actively engaging in communities and being part of the decision-making processes within communities, then that's how we will also have impact from the ground up. So that's, I mean, this brings us to the end of our conversation. I am feeling a bit sad, actually. I thought an hour and a half was long enough, but I realized that there's a lot that we wanted to cover, and there's a lot more that can be said. Thank you so much, Zanele, for really bringing yourself fully to our conversation and just for sharing all your insights with us. I definitely hope that next time we can plan this way earlier and we can have even more of these discussions. So thank you so much just for that. If we're in a room, the thing about webinars is that I can't tell people to clap for you, but we are. But thank you so much. And thank you, Kels, for organizing this space and for sort of bringing this as a conversation as well and bringing it forward. I think there can never be a time where such discussions are not necessary, even if we are having a discussion, because people always say we do all talk and no action, but I feel like there can't be action if we're not talking about what these problems are. So thank you so much. I am going to end our webinar. Once I receive a generated recording of the webinar, I'm going to share that with all of you. I'll probably upload it on the Activate's YouTube page as well, and we can have this as our first conversation. I think this is a nice platform that we definitely need to explore some more. So yeah, thank you, Kels, for your ideas around the webinar.
Sure. Also, Nomtika, just a quick one. This is just a quick announcement here. So Activate is planning to have a sexual gender-based violence Imbizo, provincial Imbizo, taking place specifically in the KZN area, where we look at specifically the high increase of rape and sexual violence in the province itself, because we need to also know this is directly impacting on intimate partner violence based on research that has been coming out specifically from that province. And it then directly impacts even more on the prevalence of HIV within the province around these young girls. So we would be hosting that provincial Imbizo on the 28th of March, 2020. And we're hosting it at KwaMashu Community Hall. So I know there's KwaMashu F Community Hall. So we would also appreciate if there's anyone willing to also come through and have engagements with these young people. It's also the space where you can also come in and engage even further, but also looking at quickly sharing inputs on the sexual assault policy from the DOH that already exists.
Sure. Okay. Absolutely. So 28th of March, a sexual violence in Bizo, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good rest of your day. And if you still want to be in this digital space, we do have a Twitter chat happening now at 1 on
We'll
Presidential
see you
Youth
there.
Empowerment Initiative. So I'll see you there. Bye.
Bye.